Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating topic, the making of a global world. Now listen, when most of us hear a word like globalization, we instantly think of, the internet, airplanes, smartphones, or maybe an economic system that just popped up in the last 50 years or so. But today, we are going to completely bust that myth. We are going to explore how the making of our global, interconnected world actually has a massive, sweeping history that goes way, way back.
To prove that globalization isn't just some modern invention, let me ask you a really quick question. Did you know that the noodles you love eating might have actually traveled all the way from China to the West, eventually becoming spaghetti? It's true. Or consider this. Arab traders likely took pasta to Sicily, an island in Italy, way back in the 5th century. Now, the exact origins might forever remain a mystery, but this whole guesswork brilliantly shows how even everyday food points to incredible, long-distance cultural contact, long before the internet ever existed.
So, here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll kick things off with the pre-modern world, then we'll look at the domino effect of food, trade, and disease. Next, we'll dive into the 19th century economy, followed by tech and colonialism, and then the tragic impact of rinderpest and indentured labor, before doing a super quick check on your understanding.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the pre-modern world, and its surprisingly long history.
Okay, we are taking a massive time jump backwards, way before modern transport, just to see how restless and mobile our ancestors really were. This 10th century memorial stone from the Goa Museum is absolute proof. It clearly shows a ship. See, from ancient times, travelers, traders, priests, and pilgrims crossed vast, dangerous distances. Why did they do it? Well, for knowledge, opportunity, spiritual fulfillment, or sometimes just to escape persecution. And they never traveled empty-handed. They carried goods, money, values, skills, ideas, and yep, even inventions.
Let's just map out this timeline for a second, almost like we're drawing it on a whiteboard. As early as 3000 BCE, an active coastal trade linked the Indus Valley civilizations with present-day West Asia. For over a millennium, cowries, the Hindi cowrie, or seashells used as currency, found their way from the Maldives all the way across to China and East Africa. By the 5th century, as we saw, pasta was in Sicily. By the 7th century, we can literally trace the long-distance spread of disease-carrying germs. So by the 13th century, these global links had become absolutely unmistakable.
Moving on to Section 2, food, trade, and disease, and the massive domino effect they caused.
Those ancient routes we just talked about, they didn't just move objects. They kicked off a massive domino effect of cultural and biological exchange that fundamentally reshaped human societies. Think about your dinner plate tonight. A lot of our most common foods, like potatoes, soya, groundnuts, maize, tomatoes, chillies, and sweet potatoes, were completely unknown to our ancestors in India until about 5 centuries ago. That's right, even the humble aloo was only introduced in Europe and Asia after Christopher Columbus accidentally discovered the vast continent that would later become the Americas. Food is, honestly, the ultimate world traveler.
But here is where this domino effect gets really intense. Let's compare Europe before and after this exchange. Pre-Columbus, European diets severely lacked variety, and starvation was a very real risk. Post-Columbus, the introduction of the humble potato meant Europe's poor began to eat better and live longer. Sounds great, right? But it created a super dangerous dependency. Ireland's poorest peasants became so completely dependent on potatoes that when a terrible crop disease struck in the mid-1840s, hundreds of thousands died of starvation and what we now know as the Irish potato famine. Literally, one single crop changed the fate of millions.
And unfortunately, food wasn't the only thing hitching a ride on these trade routes. In the 16th century, European sailors found a sea route to Asia and also crossed the Western Ocean to America. And this is where we see the sheer biological horror of colonialism. The Spanish conquerors didn't just use military might to take over, they carried deadly diseases like smallpox. As the historian Alfred Crosby noted, smallpox was the most powerful weapon, one to which the conquerors were mostly immune. But it completely devastated the original inhabitants of America, who had absolutely zero immunity due to their long isolation. This is what we mean when we say the world shrank. It became terrifyingly, intimately interconnected.
All right, Section 3, the 19th century economy. This is where we see a world completely transformed.
Fast forward with me now to the period between 1815 and 1914. This is the era where the modern global economy truly takes shape, shifting the entire world into a totally new gear. The absolutely crucial concept for this era is what economists identify as the three flows. Understanding this breakdown is like unlocking the structural pillar of the 19th century economy. First, you have the flow of trade, which back then was largely bulk goods like cloth or wheat. Second, the flow of labor, meaning the massive migration of people desperately searching for work. And third, the movement of capital for short-term or long-term investments over massive distances. These three flows were deeply interwoven and affected people's everyday lives more intensely than ever before.
Let's look at a prime, real-world example of how these flows actually worked: the British Corn Laws. So, in the late 18th century, Britain's population was absolutely booming, which pushed food prices sky high. Under heavy pressure from wealthy landlords, the government restricted the import of corn. These policies were known as the Corn Laws. But industrialists and urban city dwellers, who were furious at these high food prices, eventually forced the government to abolish them. Now, watch the dominoes fall. Without the Corn Laws, food was imported so cheaply that British agriculture simply couldn't compete. Vast areas of farmland were left completely uncultivated, and thousands upon thousands of men and women were instantly thrown out of work. Because British agriculture was ruined by those cheap imports, all those newly unemployed workers had to go somewhere, right? They flocked to the crowded cities or migrated overseas in staggering numbers. Seeing scenes of thousands of immigrants waiting to board ships really brings this reality to life. This is exactly what that flow of labor looks like on the ground. Millions of people migrating globally simply because food production shifted on the other side of the world. But you have to wonder, how are all these goods, capital, and millions of people suddenly moving around the world so quickly?
That brings us to Section 4, Technology and Colonialism, the Physical Engine of Empire.
See, we literally cannot imagine this transformed 19th century world without the railways, steamships, and the telegraph. But it's super vital to understand that these weren't just cool, random inventions that popped out of nowhere. They were directly driven by the social and economic needs of colonization. Colonization actively stimulated massive new investments in transport. Faster railways, lighter wagons, and much larger steamships helped move food and resources way more cheaply and quickly from faraway, inland farms directly to final markets in Europe. Technology was, quite literally, the physical engine powering the empire.
However, we really need to pause here and acknowledge the darker side of this story. Yes, trade flourished and European markets expanded rapidly. But in many parts of the world, getting pulled into a closer relationship with this booming world economy meant a very painful, often brutal loss of freedoms and livelihoods. Late 19th century European conquests produced devastating economic and social changes for the people they colonized.
Let's look closer at that in Section 5, Renderpest and Indentured Labor, the True Human Cost.
To truly grasp this human cost, we have to look at two of the most heartbreaking case studies in modern history. Let's start with Africa. Historically, Africa had abundant land and a relatively small population. For centuries, people sustained themselves on their land and livestock. They rarely worked for wages. But then came Rinderpest, an absolutely devastating cattle plague. It arrived in the late 1880s, carried by infected cattle imported all the way from British Asia to feed Italian soldiers invading Eritrea in East Africa. Notice on the timeline how it moved west like a terrifying forest fire, reaching the Atlantic coast by 1892 and the southernmost tip, the Cape, by 1897.
Let's walk through the brutal step-by-step logic of what happened next. Step 1, Rinderpest killed a staggering 90% of the cattle. Step 2, this immense loss completely destroyed traditional African livelihoods overnight. Step 3, European planters, mine owners, and colonial governments successfully monopolized whatever scarce cattle remained. And finally, Step 4, by controlling the cattle, European colonizers were able to conquer, subdue Africa, and force Africans into the wage labor market. A biological disaster was literally weaponized as a tool for conquest.
And while Africa was facing Rinderpest, back home, India was facing the tragedy of indentured labor, a practice so cruel it was often described as a new system of slavery. In the mid-19th century, cottage industries in India rapidly declined and land rents rose, forcing the poor deeply into debt. Millions of vulnerable workers from regions like eastern Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India, and Tamil Nadu were hired under incredibly strict 5-year contracts. They were shipped off to work on plantations and in mines in places as far away as the Caribbean, almost always under abusive, deceptive conditions. It was only thanks to fierce, relentless opposition by India's nationalist leaders that this cruel system was finally abolished in 1921.
Finally, Section 6, check your understanding. Time to master the concepts.
All right, take a deep breath. We have covered a massive amount of historical ground today, but you now have the conceptual mastery to tackle the trickiest textbook concepts effortlessly. For instance, explaining the effects of abolishing the Corn Laws and the coming of Rinderpest. Look at how easy this is for you now. Abolishing the Corn Laws meant cheap food imports, which ruined British agriculture, caused massive unemployment, and forced a huge global migration of labor. And Rinderpest? It killed 90% of Africa's cattle, destroyed independent livelihoods, and allowed colonizers to force Africans into the wage labor market. See, you just follow the dominoes.
Let's do a super rapid-fire review to lock this into your long-term memory. Remember the major structural pillars we discussed. First, the three flows of the 19th century economy: trade, labor, and capital. Second, the massive impact of technology, like how railways and steamships physically enabled colonialism across the globe. And finally, always remember that cultural exchange in the pre-modern world happened way before modern transport, carrying everything from pasta and potatoes to disease-carrying germs.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. The next time you look at a plate of aloo sabzi or read a headline about global trade in the news, ask yourself, how does understanding this long, deeply interconnected history of dominoes change the way you see our world today? History isn't just a boring list of dead facts to memorize. It is the living, breathing foundation of the very everyday lives we lead right now. Keep asking great questions, keep following those dominoes, and I'll catch you next time.